Blessings in Jesus, dear friends. My name is James Jacob Prash from Memorial Ministries, coming to you here on RTN, Christian Internet TV and Radio. RTN is a multifaceted, multi-formatted, multi-platformed Christian media service that we do unto the Lord, and we're in it for the Lord. We're in it for reaching the unsaved with the gospel, and we're in it for you. We have a variety of features from social media to podcasts, of course, Christian TV and radio, a range of speakers and Bible expositors, evangelists, Christian authors. We are here again to glorify Jesus and to see people come to a saving knowledge of the truth and to edify the body of Christ for the times in which we live. This has been a very unhappy Christmas and unhappy Hanukkah for me personally, and for all of us here at Moriel. I only celebrate the Nativity myself. I don't really celebrate Christmas per se, but many Christians do, and it's a family time. And Hanukkah is something that Jesus celebrated in John 10, and because of its theological importance, and because my family were Israeli believers, we always followed Hanukkah as Jesus did, but this is not a happy Hanukkah time. I'm in Tennessee at the moment in the United States. I've just been back from the Far East for about a week. And after I got back from Singapore, I called Dave Royal. Dave Royal is a trustee of Moriel UK. He'd been a trustee of Moriel UK. And he's the founder of Moriel's first children's mission, Ebion in Africa. And he's a co-founder of Moriel Missions. All that came out of it in the Philippines, Africa, Thailand, all of our other missions, Japan, basically came out of the initial work that Dave Royal and his wife, Lynn, pioneered. Anyway, when I got back from Singapore, we learned that his father went to be with the Lord. His father was a believer and went to be with the Lord, but Dave himself was in hospital. I called Dave to give him my condolences and just to see how he was doing with his own health issues. Dave suffers, his family suffers from a type 1 diabetes that's genetic. His young son, Aaron, required organ transplant. Dave was not in a good condition when I spoke to him. He had bilateral renal failure, and his father had died. Well, I got up today here in Tennessee and checked my email, and I was hit with a double barrel burst of bad news. The first was Dave Royal has gone to be with the Lord. Again, this is somebody who was my brother and my friend. We first began working together in the Lord's service when he was a pastor of a church in Manchester, England, where my grandfather was from, and then he was called to the mission field. To make a longer story short, he pioneered our first children's work with AIDS babies, HIV children in Africa in the early days of the HIV crisis, when it was a death sentence and pediatric AIDS was just killing children in droves. It was before antiretrovirals were invented. Anyway, Dave and his wife, Lynn, took care of these children and had a team, and their sons were involved. And they ran it like a family environment instead of like an institution or an orphanage. Again, all these children's parents were dead of AIDS, basically, usually, and the children themselves are HIV or AIDS. And we emphasize things like nutrition and hygiene, but above all, we emphasize Jesus and prayer. And Dave and Lynn just used to groom the children to go to be with the Lord. They would have died of AIDS by the time they were 7 or 8. So he got them as babies and small children and just basically groomed them to go be with Jesus at a very young age. And then he would bury them. Very difficult work. But there's little children in heaven now who knew the gospel and came to faith believing in Jesus. uh, who went not just as suffer the children unto me, theirs is the kingdom of heaven, but they had relationships with the Lord. Some of them were old enough to be saved before they gave up the ghost. It was a very challenging, again, very difficult work that the Lord called Dave and his wife Lynn to. And it was a challenge for Moriel. Um, but it happened. In time, with the antiretrovirals, of course, these children began to survive, and the ministry had to be reinvented into a children's village because the children were reaching teenage years, something we never expected would have happened. We might, in a matter of speaking, say that the ministry of Ebion, pioneered by Dave and Lynn, was a victim of its own success, in that it was a victim of its own success. The children were no longer just dying at a very young age. But Dave battled this diabetes and it got worse and worse. It affected his eyesight. He was eventually became blind, couldn't drive, which was essential. He had neuropathy in his feet, as diabetics can often get, and a high susceptibility to gangrene. And an environment like Africa, Dave needed to retire and come back from the mission field to the UK. He did that, and he remained in an advisory position, of course, for Ebion, but he stayed with Moriel as a trustee in his semi-retirement. Now he's just gone to be with the Lord. His father's funeral has not even happened yet. His father's funeral, his father's remains have not even been buried. And now Dave has given up the ghost. Well, he's with Jesus and he's with his father. And he's with those children who he told about the Lord Jesus who died of AIDS. Dave has gone to his reward. His gain, though, is our loss. And I think of his wife, of his sons, Aaron, Anthony, and Chris. And I think of our children, now teenagers, in Africa at Ebion. Dave was the only father they ever knew or ever had, apart from the Father in heaven. It's just been very, very difficult day. And I think what the future Christmas seasons are going to be like for Dave's family, it will not be a time to look forward to. It'll be a time of sadness. So that was Dave. Please pray for his wife, Lynn, and for their sons. But then, less than an hour after that, less than 1 hour after that, I get another email. This one, news from Scotland. Beryl Hunter has been with Moriel on and off for more than 35 years. She's an important team member with her husband, Peter and Beryl Hunter. Beryl is the booking secretary for Moriel for speaking engagements. She manages my itinerary and things like this when I'm in Great Britain, but she's also our conference organizer. She organizes the conferences in England and other events such as day seminars and so forth. And she wears the third hat. She is also somebody who is involved in some of our work in Israel, some of Moriel's work in Israel. So today, I get an email that their son, Peter and Beryl's son, Andrew, in Scotland, was found in bed, not alive. He was found dead in bed on Boxing Day. Boxing Day is what some people call the second day of Christmas. It's actually a kind of holiday in England itself and in British Commonwealth countries like Australia, New Zealand, to a degree in Canada. It's the second day of Christmas. But it's celebrated as a holiday in its own right. In any event, it's not a happy Christmas, not at all. And other Christmases will not be the same, obviously, for Peter and Beryl. Now, they're sort of like me. They don't really celebrate Christmas, but they certainly celebrate the Nativity. And anyway, I'm just devastated, and all of us at Moriel are devastated. Please pray for Beryl and Peter Hunter. Just finding their son, Andrew, his name was Andrew, in Scotland. Uh, they found him dead. Um, they were expecting him to come down and visit them in England for the holiday, and he didn't show up. And one thing led to another, and they found him deceased. So it's not been a good time for them, and not for us. Moriel is a family. Again, please pray for Peter and Beryl Hunter, and please pray for the family of Dave Royal, his wife Lynn, and their sons. This is not good. I'm sorry to moan and sound like I'm whinging, but that's what's happening. Bear with me. We're going to do a rather shorter teaching for Word for the weekend, given our circumstances. Be perfectly honest, my head is elsewhere with all what's going on. But nonetheless, we'll have a Bible study. I'm sorry if I'm not communicating too well. Turn with me, please, to the book of Genesis, chapter 13, verse 6. And the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were great, and they were not able to remain together. That speaks of the story of Lot and Abraham. But that was amicable. That was an amicable divide. And Abraham came to the rescue of Lot. But in Genesis chapter 12, we read something else in verse 6. And Abram passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem, which is today called Nablus, to the oak of Moreh. This is a place called Elon Moreh, which I know well. We've held Bible studies on top of Elon Moreh. Now, the Canaanite was then in the land. From the time of Abraham, the first Jew, the Canaanite was then in the land. The Canaanites, we're told from the Table of Nations in Genesis, are not Semites. They're not like Jews and Arabs. They are descendants of Ham, who did not stay in the rightful abode God wanted for them. This is something that relates in part to the curse on the Canaanites, on Cana, in the book of Genesis, chapter 9, verse 3. But what are we saying here? The book of Yasher, an ancient history book, tells us that his father Ham and his brothers wanted Ham to stay in Africa to the apportionment God gave them. These are the three sons of Jonah. Japhet, who was Eurasia. The Middle East was Shem, and Africa was Ham. Or, that was it. But he didn't. He went into the Middle East instead of going south. He went east, and they settled in the land of Canaan, and they became the Canaanites and went into absolutely diabolical religious practices involving everything from bestiality to human sacrifice to pedophilia, demon worship, things that are atrocious. God told Moses, don't do the things of the nations that I'm going to drive out before you. And those nations were, of course, the Canaanites. When Abraham first came, long before the Exodus, when he first entered the land that God showed him, God showed the land to Abraham before he showed it to Moses. This land that I show you. The Canaanite was already there. There's only two people who have a claim to a historical presence as being indigenous in what is today the land of Israel, including the West Bank, That is from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. That is the Canaanites who no longer exist and who shouldn't have been there in the first place, and the Hebrews. The Canaanites were there from the time of Abraham. They were there from a very early point, but had no right to be there. And God did curse them, as God told Noah in the prophecy of Noah in Genesis 9. There were no Arabs. The Arabs came from Arabia at a later point. The Arabs, like the Hebrews, were descendant from Shem. Shem. They were Semites. Arabs are Semites. They're Semitic. And the Arabs came from Arabia. Arabia. Okay. So the indigenous people were not Arabs. God promised various lands to the nations that came from the Arab world. The Arabs are descendants of Abraham, but not through Isaac and Jacob. They're descendants of Abraham through Ishmael, whose descendants intermarried with the descendants of Esau. So you had a conflict in the womb of Rachel between Jacob and Esau. There was a conflict between Jew and Arab right from the beginning. In Genesis 25, right from the beginning, there was a conflict. Okay. Islam tries to teach that it was not Isaac who was the chosen son, but that it was Ishmael. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the biblical pedigree to which the Messiah would come. Islam replaces the promised one, Christ, with Muhammad, and saying it was through Ishmael instead of Isaac. And then, of course, the descendants of Isaac, of Ishmael, intermarry with the descendants of Esau, who despised his birthright. That is the beginning of the anthropology of the geographical region we today call Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, etc. That's where it was. The indigenous people, according to the biblical record, were the Jews. Now, the archaeological record, as we've said many times, bears this out. Bears this out. The only one who were there as long as the Jews no longer exist, those are the Canaanites, who should not have been there to begin with. They should have been in Africa. So the conflict begins, not now, not with the Zionist movement or the rebirth of Israel as a nation. The conflict begins in the book of Genesis. It begins when the two twins are struggling in the womb. I'm reading from the book of Genesis, where God tells her that there are two nations in your womb, chapter 25, verse 23. The Lord said to her, two nations, he tells Rebekah, two nations are in your womb, and two people shall separate from your body, and one people shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. This goes on. Rebekah has these two sons, and then with Rachel, she marries Jacob, and Leah marries Jacob. From this, the Jewish nations come in Genesis chapter 12, the 12 tribes of Israel. The conflict begins right away, all the way in Genesis. Chapter 25 of Genesis, we read about the descendants of Ishmael. The descendants of Ishmael. Okay. Notice they also had 12 tribes, 12 princes. just like the Hebrews. God gave them a land, just as he gave it to the Hebrews. Okay. And the story then goes on. That was the beginning of the conflict in the Middle East. I know many of you know this. The Jews were taken in captivity by the Assyrians, but later returned after the Babylonian captivity, with the Hebrews taken captive from Judah. So you have the Assyrian captivity in 720 BC and the Babylonian captivity in 585. But the captives came back. We read this in Second Chronicles, in Ezra, and in Nehemiah. Some of the Hebrews who remained in the 10 northern tribal areas of Israel, they intermarried with the Assyrian colonists, and these became the Samaritans. There were moves to exile the Jews, but they always came back. The idea of the Jews returning to their land is not new. It is not new. Isaiah chapter 11, verse 11 says, there'll be not once, but twice they will return from exile. Only twice. The first was after the Babylonian captivity in the days of Ezra, Nehemiah, Haggai, and Zechariah. And the second is at the present time in history. This goes on. When the Exodus happened with Moses, it became very interesting what transpired. Remember, in the eyes of God, Jew and Arab are brothers. Jacob and Esau were brothers. Ishmael and Isaac were brothers. We could also kind of say that they are anthropological cousins, but God calls them brothers theologically. When the Hebrews came out of Egypt, going to the promised land, it was not a land dwelt with Arabs. It was still dwelt by Canaanites, who God said he would drive out because of their wickedness. In verse 17 of Numbers chapter 20, the Hebrews beseech their neighbors, their cousins, their brothers, please let us pass through your land. We shall not pass through field or through vineyard. We shall not even drink water from a well. We shall go along the king's highway, not turning to the right or to the left until we pass through your territory. We just want to come through it to get to where we're going. Edom, however, Edom means red. The mountains of that area are red, and they're etymologically related to Esau being a man of reddish complexion. Edom, however, said to him, you shall not pass through us, lest I come out with the sword against you. You can't pass through. Don't tell us you're not going to eat our food or drink our water or come near to our private land that you just want to pass through. No, you can't come through. And he comes out with an army. And again, the sons of Israel said to him, we'll go up by the highway, and if I or my livestock do drink any of your water, I'll pay its price. Let me only pass through on my feet, nothing else. We don't want any trouble. We just want to get to where we're going to. Please let us come through. And again he said, you shall not pass through. And Edom came out against him with a heavy force and a strong hand, ready for war. Thus Edom refused to allow Israel to pass through his territory. So what did Israel do? Say, you want a war? Let's have one. No, they backed down. They said no. So Israel turned away from him in verse 21. God made it clear to the Hebrews that that land today in Jordan is part of the land that God promised to the descendants of Ishmael, that we are not to go there, that we are not to go to the Arab land that belongs to your brothers. The land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan belongs to you, the land to the east to your brethren. They wouldn't even fight them. They wouldn't go to war. When the Edomites came out ready for war, they wouldn't fight back. They just turned and went another way. Then the Lord, we came out from the Kadesh, the sons of Israel. The whole congregation came to Mount Hor. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron at Mount Hor by the border of the land, saying, Aaron shall be gathered to his people, and so forth. And the story continues. But they avoided any conflict with the forebearers of the Arabs. They wanted no conflict with them, none. The Arabs came out ready for war. The Edomites, the Hebrews would not want to fight them. All right, you won't let us pass through your land. God will take us a different way. We don't covet your land. Don't covet ours, but we're not going to covet yours. Well, let's look on a little bit further. Chapter 23, verse 21. The Amorites, another ancestral forebearer of the Arabs. Israel sent messengers to Sihon, king of the Amorites, saying, Let me pass through your land. Will not turn off into field or vineyard. We will not drink water from the wells. We will go by the king's highway until we pass through your border. Now, what is believed to be the king's highway still exists in Jordan. I'm not saying it's the same road, but there's a paved road, a paved highway called the King's Highway that is believed to be built on or adjacent the very ancient one on the eastern banks of the Dead Sea and in a bit. Sihon would not permit Israel to pass through this border. No. Once again, they wanted just to pass through. No. So Sihon gathered all his people and went out against Israel in the wilderness and came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. Now notice, the first time this happened with Edom, they came out ready for war with the Israelites, the Hebrews. And the Hebrews said, no, we're not going to fight you. You don't want us to pass through, we'll go another way. We didn't come here looking for a war. We only want the land that's ours. We don't want yours. And if you don't want to be a good neighbor to us, okay, but let's not have a war. Let's have peace. We'll go another way. But in chapter 21, it becomes very different with the Amorites. They say, we're going to attack you. They didn't just come out ready to attack like the Edomites did. They actually attacked Israel. They attacked the Hebrews. They came out in the wilderness and came to Jahaz and fought against Israel. Then Israel struck him with the edge of the sword and took possession of his land from the Arnon to the Jabbok, as far as the sons of Ammon. Ammon is like Amman, the modern capital of Jordan, the capital Amman. This was the land of the Ammonites. Okay. Jabbok is where Jacob wrestled with the angel of the Lord, a Christophany. And as far as the sons of Ammon, for the border of the sons of Israel, was Jazer. And Israel took all these cities and lived in these cities of the Amorites in Heshbon and in all her villages. We didn't want to fight with you. We just wanted to pass through. You don't want us to pass through and you come out ready for war? We back down. We didn't want a war. We wanted peace. We wanted coexistence. But the Amorites wanted war. They attacked. And Israel counterattacked in self-defense. That is what happened in the beginning. As it was in the beginning, is now. The Romans deported Jews after the rebellion of 70 AD, as Rome saw it, and sold them as slaves in the marketplace in Alexandria, Egypt. But Jews were left in the land, particularly Galilee. Later on, the Byzantine Empire, they restricted the Jews greatly, but they didn't drive them out. Not until the Arabs came following Mohammed in the 7th century with the Arab conquests, following the teachings of Mohammed to wage holy war, were the Jews actually driven out. They were ordered, driven, forced out of the land by the Arabs. This is in the 7th century. But the Arabs didn't last long. Eventually, it became Turkish. And the Turks subjugated and enslaved the Arabs into a slave class. This went on all the way to World War I. The story of Lawrence of Arabia went on for centuries and centuries and centuries. The Crusades came, took it from the Turks for some time. And the Crusades sought to colonize the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan. That in the second century Common Era, AD, the Romans renamed Palestine after the ancient Philistines that no longer existed. That is where the name Palestinian came from. The Palestinians were originally the Philistines. Palestinian is simply the Latinization of Philistine, and these were Indo-Europeans. They were not Arabs, and they no longer exist either, any more than the Canaanites do. So, the Crusades come. The Crusades are eventually defeated at the Horns of Hattin in Galilee, and are driven back to Europe. It was a brutal war, but it was not Arabs. It was, again, Turkish Muslims who prevailed under Salah ad-Din. We talk now about the times of Richard the Lionhearted and things like this. Okay, this goes on. Various people try to control the land over the centuries. Napoleon invades the Middle East, defeats the Mamelukes, all kinds of things happen, but the Turks still have it until World War I, when Turkey aligned with Germany against Britain. The British, mainly Australian and New Zealand troops, Anzacs, despite the terrible defeat at Gallipoli, had a tremendous victory in Beersheba, the biblical city of Beersheba. And they took the land, and the British general Allenby enters Jerusalem. And at that time, the door was open for a return of the Jews. There were born-again Christians in England when Britain was still a superpower. William Wilberforce, the Earl of Shaftesbury, people like that had always campaigned for the right of the Jews to return to their land. These were evangelical Christians. But it happens, and eventually the Bellflower Declaration says the Jews can come back, a declaration Britain would renege on. But the Jews begin coming back. With them, Arabs begin coming from other countries. Far away is Tunisia, certainly Egypt, certainly eastern regions beyond the Jordan. Because when the Zionists came, they began draining the swamps and irrigating the deserts. The land began to blossom again, and Arabs came there for a better living. Originally, the Bedouin Arabs, who still serve in the Israeli army voluntarily, supported Zionism and still do because it was better for them economically. Infant mortality went down, longevity increased, unemployment decreased, their standard of living went up under the Hebrews. Today, you still have Bedouin Arabs. The closest thing to indigenous Arabs are the Bedouins of the Negev. They did not live in Galilee in large numbers or in Jerusalem. They lived in the Negev, south of Israel's heartland. And they are pro-Zionist. Another people who are not Muslim, but who are also anthropological cousins to the Arabs, are the Druzes. To this day, the Druzes are pro-Zionist and serve in the Israeli army. There were also European Muslims who fled Europe and came to live in Israel, called the Circassians. The Circassians are Muslims who serve in the Israeli army. This lie, we are told, that all of the Muslim people, or even all of the Arab people, because the Bedouins are the quintessential Arabs, are against Israel is ridiculous. That's not true, and it never was. The Bedouins of Jordan were never enemies of the Jews. Never. You'll see that modern Jordan is 70% so-called Palestinian Arab and about 30% Bedouin. The Hashemite kingdom of Jordan is a Bedouin government. They came from Arabia. King Hussein of Jordan wanted peace with Israel. But this is what happened. King Abdullah of Jordan wanted peace with Israel, but the other Arabs assassinated him in the Al-Aqsa Mosque for trying to make peace with Israel. Notice what has happened in the 20th century and the 21st century is the same thing that happened in the 14th century. The Hebrews wanted coexistence. They wanted peace. We'll pay you for anything. We don't want to fight with you. We just want to coexist in our land. You can have yours. We don't want any trouble. Some of them accepted it. The majority did not. The anthropological record confirms the historicity of the biblical record. The Hebrews are the indigenous people. Archaeology doesn't lie. Yet today, demonstrable lies are propagated, even by academics, even by jurists, even by professional diplomats. Things that they know are not true are repeated and repeated and repeated in the style of Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister. Tell a lie often enough and people will think it's the truth. Well, it's not the truth. You have a Muslim jurist on an international court in The Hague, indicting Benjamin Netanyahu for fighting back against Hamas following the October 7th attacks, and he's a war criminal. The fact that Israel was attacked and that Hamas uses its own people as human shields, uses schools, hospitals, mosques, and anything else it can as facilities to store ordnance. The fact that it uses its own people as human shields, and at least 1,000 missiles, rockets, and projectiles fired by Hamas at Israel misfired and came down on Gaza, sometimes killing their own people. And Hamas shooting its own people for trying to escape instead of staying there to be human shields when the Israelis were forced to fire back in self-defense. And this ridiculous kangaroo court, of which the United States is not a member, nor Israel, wants to indict Benjamin Netanyahu as a war criminal. You've got the United Nations. It has failed, and failed. The United Nations Relief and Work Agency in Gaza was actively cooperating and collaborating with Hamas in Gaza. In Lebanon, Israel withdrew from southern Lebanon when it was attacked. And when it withdrew, the United Nations assured them that the UNIFIL forces would prevent Hezbollah from entering southern Lebanon along the border of Israel. The United Nations forces, the UNIFIL forces, did nothing. They allowed the Iranian-sponsored Hezbollah and their weapons and their projectiles to be set up again along the Israeli border and to the area just north of it. The United Nations collaborated with Islamic terror in Gaza and turned a blind eye in Lebanon. And now the UN condemns Israel for fighting back. Even though the failure of the UN to do what it committed itself to is responsible for what happened. The predecessor of the UN was the League of Nations, who voted for the partition. Ute proceditus juris, retaining the borders. By international law, when an area is decolonized, it retains its borders. Israel was entitled to all the land from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. But in the partition established by the UN, or implemented by the UN, where there was a reestablishment of Israel, Israel did not get all the land it was legally entitled to. There had been Jewish settlements on the West Bank in the 1920s that were destroyed in Muslim Arab pogroms. A lot of what is called settlements today are simply Israelis rebuilding the Jewish settlements that had been there and were destroyed in the early 20th century. Yet we are told that Israel is guilty and in violation of international law because of its settlement policies, UN Resolution 2334. Now, by international law is only determined by treaty, by international treaties. That is how international law is defined, and it's what constitutes it. A UN resolution, either a Security Council resolution or a General Assembly resolution, has no legal binding. It's a resolution. The American Congress or the British Parliament can pass a law or they can pass a resolution. Law comes from legislation. A resolution, oh, we're going to honor the Queen on such and such a day, in the memorial of the Queen Elizabeth, the anniversary of her death or something. It's a resolution. Without any legal basis in international law, ignoring ute praesidius juris, they are saying that these resolutions made by the UN with 52 Muslim countries in the membership of the UN, 52, have legal merit and are binding as law. But they have no basis in law. It's like a law that's not constitutional. A court that's not constitutional. The corruption is unbelievable. But it's always been like this. The only thing the Israelis wanted was the land that was theirs. They wanted to live there peaceably and coexist. If you didn't want to be their friends, don't be our enemies. Let's not have a war. But once you attack us, we're going to defend ourselves and defend what's ours. Yet you have people, university students, people who you would think would be intelligent enough to be able to read history, convinced that Israel is a colonial presence from Europe. Turkey colonized that land, driven out by the British. The Crusades colonized that land, driven out by the Turks. The Jews never colonized that land. They were the indigenous people. Archaeology proves the historicity of the scriptures. What European country colonized Israel and sent Jews there as colonists? None. None. Under the Bellflower Declaration, Jews were allowed to return there, and they did. But the British revoked the Bellflower Declaration. Jews perished in concentration camps because it had been revoked. The British fought the Zionists. When Jews came out of concentration camps at the end of the Second World War, the British government put them back in internment camps in Cyprus. No, there was never any colonization by any European power of the land of Israel. And if it was, it would have been colonized by Europeans. Instead, it was colonized by the indigenous people. Well, that's an impossibility. An indigenous people cannot be a colonist. Some people have said ridiculous things. One of them is Candace Owen, a woman who I once respected. I no longer do. She converted to Roman Catholicism, and she went off the rails in her thinking on a number of issues when she did that, including her attitude towards Israel and the Jews. She said, well, even if they are indigenous, that would be like the American Indians saying that we want to have our own country in the United States. This is both illogical and hypocritical. The American Indians do have reserved land. Native Americans, sometimes called Indians still, do have reserved land. You have Apache reservations, Hopi reservations, Seminole reservations. So, as the indigenous people, they do have reserved land. Why should the Jews then, as an indigenous people, not have reserved land in the West Bank, which you call settlements, that are largely the reconstruction of Jewish settlements that had always been there, but that the Muslims destroyed? They're only rebuilding what they once had, and the land was seized from them. Not only that, but indigenous Americans, Native American tribes, are not a demographic minority of the people in the United States. Most of them are Euro Americans, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, and Afro Americans. It's true that the rights to their own land of the Native Americans are preserved by law and need to be, but why shouldn't the rights of the Hebrews be preserved by law? But the point being is, Jews are the demographic majority. They are not the minority. They are the majority in the land in which they were and are the indigenous people. Oh boy. These facts are both legally and historically undeniable, but they don't matter. They don't matter in the thinking of the United Nothing, of the Arab world, or of the political left. They do, however, matter to God. The book of Zechariah makes it clear that those who try to destroy Israel make themselves the enemy of the God of Israel. And Jesus himself will fight against them in Zechariah chapter 12, verse 10. They're the enemies of God. It is also clear that these terrible things would happen in the Middle East. And in their desperation, the Jews who were there will turn to the Messiah who they rejected to save them, Yeshua, Jesus. It is true to say that the Arab world does not want to look at certain facts. It is also true to say that the Jewish world does not want to look at certain facts. The facts are that Jesus is a Jew, a Jewish rabbi, a Jewish prophet, and Christians believe a Jewish Messiah. The fact is, the first Christians were Jews, and the only reason non-Jews believe in Christianity is because Jews believed it first. The fact is, the only reason there is a New Testament is because Jews wrote it. The fact is, well, most rabbis condemned Zionism and condemned Theodor Herzl. Born-again Christians supported it, going back to the 19th century and earlier. The only real friends Jews have in Israel are Bible-believing, born-again Christians who are premillennial. They don't want to accept these facts. Oh, it's true. The political left, the Arab world, they don't want to accept the historical facts about the Jews being the indigenous people of that land. That's true. It's true that they don't want to accept the fact that there has never been a Palestinian state. It's easier to propagate the lie. We had a country called Palestine, and the Jews came and took it from us. There was never any such country. The United Nations never established it. Jordan seized the West Bank in the late 1940s. The people today calling themselves Palestinians were called Jordanians up until the 1970s. These are facts, and they don't want to accept it. The enemies of Israel don't want to accept certain facts. But the people of Israel and world Jewry does not want to accept certain facts. But facts are facts. If you want to understand what's happening, read Isaiah 11:11. I would say to my Jewish friends who don't believe. As a supporter of Zionism and of the Jewish people, I would say read Zechariah chapters 12 and 13. Then you will understand what's happening, and you'll understand why. I am aggrieved, indignant at the willful blindness and the preposterous falsehoods propagated against Israel by her enemies. But I am co-equally grieved by the blindness, the revisionism of so many Jews themselves. Those Arabs who support Israel are hated by the Muslim world. Those Jews who believe in Yeshua, Jesus, as their Messiah, are hated by the Jewish world, certainly by the religious Orthodox. The hatred instigated against Jews by radical Muslim imams is no different than the hatred instigated against Jewish believers in their Messiah, Yeshua, by ultra-Orthodox rabbis from the Hasidic community particularly. These are the realities. What you see happening now, the way the surrounding nations are reacting to Israel, is not new. At White River and with the Ehud Barak, the so-called Palestinians were offered a so-called two-state solution. In fact, Jordan is already a Palestinian state, demographically and geographically. They were offered another state and they turned it down at least twice, technically 3 times. They don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution. From the river to the sea, get rid of the indigenous people. Their only claim is their religion. Allah gave it to them. Islam dividing the whole world into Dar el-Islam and Dar el-Harb, the world of Islam and the world of the sword. It's ours because Allah has given it to us. No, Allah is not God. Yahweh, Yahovah, has given the land to the Jews. They demand you accept their Islamic religion. This is what you're seeing happening with this Islamic militancy in Ireland, in Britain, in France, in Germany, in Scandinavia. They're doing the same thing. They demand you accept their religion. A British judge issued a decision invoking Sharia, Islamic law, 2 weeks ago. Well, Israel is not going to accept Sharia, Islamic law. When Europe was still Christian, they wouldn't have done that. Remember, Islam is a divine judgment on the Judeo-Christian world for abandoning the faith of their fathers. But as it stands, it's just what's always been. Go back to Numbers, chapter 20, chapter 23. We only want to coexist. We don't want to have a war with you. We don't want your land. Just let us have our own. We were forced to conquer Gaza in self-defense, but we're happy to get out. But now that we've gotten out, you just use it as a place and a base to attack us and fire rockets and missiles at us, and to launch terrorist attacks, and to take hostages and rape women and murder children in front of their parents. Just like in Judges, now we will fight back. It's not new. That's the way it was in the beginning. And that is the way it is now. Thank you so much for listening. My name is James Jacob Prasch from Moriel Ministries, coming to you here on RTN.
Hello, and thank you for watching Moriel TV. There are so many things that are happening at Moriel Ministries worldwide, from the Philippines to Japan, to India to Africa, and back to Europe and the United States. So many of our brothers and sisters are spreading the good news of Jesus Christ to this lost world. We are so thankful for your prayers. God has been faithful and has blessed us in so many ways. If you'd like to partner with our efforts abroad and at home, please take a moment to click the link in the description and help us as the Lord leads you. Thank you very much, and God bless.